The morning she signed the papers, Adelaide Fenn told herself it was just ink on a page. It wasn't a marriage. It was a transaction, a lifeline thrown to a drowning family, and she happened to be the one doing the drowning. Her father sat in the corner of the county attorney's office, not looking at her. His hat was in his lap, and he kept turning it in slow circles, the way he always did when he didn't know what to say. He'd been turning that hat for 3 days now, ever since Rowan Callister had shown up at their door with the deed paperwork and the offer. "Pay off what you owe," Callister had said. "Or marry my son, and we'll call it settled." Adelaide had stood in the doorway of their farmhouse and looked at the man, 60 years old, silver-haired, the kind of polite that money makes possible, and she had thought, "There is no world in which this ends well for me." And then she thought of her father's medical bills stacked on the kitchen table. Thought of the note on the property. Thought of her younger sister Ruth starting her first year of nursing school in September, which required tuition that no longer existed. She signed the papers. His name was Fletcher Callister. She'd seen him twice in her life. Once at the county fair 3 years back when he'd been arguing with someone at the livestock pens, and once from across the feed store parking lot. Both times he'd looked exactly like what he was. A man who spent his days outdoors and his evenings saying very little. Tall. Dark-haired, going gray at the temples even though he was only 34. The kind of face that didn't give much away. The wedding was at the county courthouse on a Tuesday. Her father came. Ruth came, still stunned and not quite believing it, squeezing Adelaide's hand so hard the bones ached. There were no flowers. There was a judge named Hobart who'd been doing this job for 30 years, and had the expressions to show for it. Fletcher stood next to Adelaide in a clean shirt, and said the words when he was supposed to say them, and Adelaide said hers, and then it was done. In the truck on the way to his ranch, they didn't speak for 11 miles. Adelaide counted. She'd brought 2 suitcases. He'd sent a man named Percy to help load them, and Percy had been so aggressively cheerful about it that Adelaide had wanted to cry, which she hadn't, because she had decided on the courthouse steps that whatever came next, she would not cry in front of anyone on this property. The Callister Ranch sat in a wide valley east of Millhaven, Texas, backed up against a ridge of live oak and cedar that turned purple in the late afternoon. The house was bigger than she'd expected. 2 stories, stone foundation, a long porch that wrapped around the front. Not fancy. Not the kind of place someone decorated to impress. The kind of place that had been lived in hard for a long time and showed it. Fletcher pulled up in front of the house and cut the engine and sat there for a second before he spoke. "I'll show you the house," he said. "You can tell me what you need." "I don't need anything," Adelaide said. He looked at her then, directly, for the first time that day. His eyes were a particular shade of gray that she hadn't noticed before. He nodded once, like she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected, and got out of the truck. She followed. The kitchen was large and clean and smelled like coffee and cedar. There was a good cast-iron stove and a long table with 6 chairs. He showed her the bedroom she'd be using, separate from his, at the end of the hall, and it had a window that faced east and a quilt on the bed that was old and obviously hand-stitched and beautiful in a quiet way. "Bathrooms across the hall," he said. "I'm up early most days." "You don't need to be." "I don't sleep late," she said. "All right." He left her alone to unpack. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, looking at the window. The sun was going down and the sky outside was doing something spectacular that she didn't have the energy to appreciate. She thought, "I am 31 years old and I have just married a stranger to save my family from debt." She waited to feel something definitive about that. Nothing came. Just a kind of hollow, practical steadiness, like the feeling you get after you've made a decision you can't unmake. She unpacked her clothes. She put her books on the windowsill. She washed her face and went down to the kitchen because she wasn't going to sit in that room all night. Fletcher was at the stove, making something that smelled like onions and beef. He didn't look up when she came in. "I can cook," Adelaide said. "I know how to cook," he said. She sat down at the table and watched him. He moved around the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who'd been feeding himself alone for a long time. No wasted motion, no asking where anything was. They ate dinner mostly in silence. He asked her once if the food was all right. She said it was good because it was. When she reached for the salt, he passed it before she could ask. When she finished eating and started to stack her plate, he took it without comment and carried it to the sink along with his own. She noticed that. She wasn't sure why. It just seemed like the kind of thing she'd remember later. The first week was a study in careful navigation. The ranch ran on a schedule that Adelaide didn't know, and Fletcher didn't explain in words, only demonstrated by existing inside it. She watched. She asked Percy questions when Fletcher wasn't around, because Percy talked freely about everything: who worked which section of the pasture, what they were doing with the north fence, why the third horse in the barn was kept separate and treated like fragile crystal. That horse had belonged to Fletcher's wife. Percy said it matter-of-factly and then moved on, and Adelaide filed it away without asking more. She hadn't known he'd been married before. She realized she hadn't known much about him at all. His wife had died 4 years ago. A riding accident, Percy told her eventually, when she hadn't asked directly but had made the question obvious by asking about the horse's name. Isadora. The horse, not the wife. The wife's name had been Caroline, and they'd been married 6 years, and after she died, Fletcher had come back to the ranch and hadn't left much since. Adelaide thought about this alone in the evenings, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the stars come out over the ridge. She thought about what it meant to lose someone you'd chosen, and then be pushed by your father to replace that loss with a transaction. She thought she probably should have been angrier at Fletcher for that, except that every interaction she'd had with him suggested that he hadn't had much say in his father's plan either. One evening, she asked him directly. They were on the porch. She'd started sitting out there after dinner, and he'd started appearing after a while, standing at the railing, not sitting, just existing near the same space. She'd stopped finding it uncomfortable. That evening, she looked up at him and said, "Did you want this?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "My father decided the ranch needed stability. I decided it wasn't worth fighting him on. That's not the same as wanting it." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She looked back at the dark valley. "I didn't want it either, in case you were wondering." "I wasn't wondering," he said, "but I appreciate you saying it." They sat in something that was not quite companionable silence but was no longer hostile. After a while she went inside, and he stayed at the railing, and in the morning he was up before dawn as usual, and she made coffee for both of them without thinking about it, and he took the cup and said thank you, and neither of them mentioned the previous night. That was the beginning of something. She couldn't have said what. She started taking stock of the house the second week because she couldn't stand feeling useless. The ranch had 4 full-time hands besides Percy, a part-time vet who came on Thursdays, and an accountant in Millhaven who handled the books. The house itself ran on what she could only describe as determined neglect. Nothing broken, nothing dirty, but nothing comfortable either. Like someone had made sure it was functional, and then stopped caring about anything past that. She reorganized the pantry. She patched a screen door that had been loose on its hinges for what looked like months. She found a crack in the kitchen window, caulking, and fixed it. She wasn't doing it to impress him. She was doing it because her hands needed something to do, and the house was there. Fletcher noticed, but he didn't say anything about the pantry or the screen door. What he said was, one morning at breakfast, without looking up from his coffee, "Percy mentioned you asked about the Hendricks grazing lease. I heard you talking about it with him yesterday. The terms seem like you're paying over market rate." He looked up then. "You know grazing leases? My father ran cattle for 20 years before he got sick," she said. "I know enough." He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not much, just a slight recalibration, like a man adjusting where he's put his weight. "I'll pull the paperwork," he said. "I'm not trying to involve myself in your business." "I know," he said. "Pull up a chair anyway." She pulled up a chair. He spread the lease documents on the table, and she went through them with him. And by the end of it, they'd found 3 places where the terms had been written in favor of Hendricks, in ways that looked accidental, but probably weren't. Fletcher leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. "My father negotiated that lease," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her again, and this time what shifted in his expression was something she recognized. Not warmth exactly, but respect. The real kind. The kind that doesn't come with softness attached. "I'll have the attorney look at it," he said. The trouble with Rowan Callister started in the 3rd week. Adelaide had known it was coming. The man had arranged this marriage, like it was a business acquisition, and she'd watched him at the courthouse with the particular attention she saved, for people she didn't trust. He'd looked at her the way you look at a property you've just purchased, and it had taken everything in her to hold her expression steady. He came to the ranch on a Wednesday with another man, a lawyer named Quincy Deal, who had the kind of smile that didn't reach anything above his chin. They sat in the front room, and Rowan talked about legacy and responsibility and what was good for the family, and all of it was pointed at Adelaide in a way that was obviously pointed at Fletcher. What he was saying underneath all of it was, "I expect her to stay in her lane." Adelaide sat across from him with her hands in her lap and her back straight and let him finish. Then she said, "Mr. Callister, I appreciate you coming out. I'll let Fletcher know you stopped by." She stood up. She walked to the front door and opened it. She stood there and waited. Rowan Callister had not become the man he was by being made to feel small, and his face showed it, but he stood up. He and Quincy Deal walked out. When his truck was down the drive and turning onto the county road, Adelaide shut the door and stood in the quiet hallway and breathed. She didn't tell Fletcher that evening. She wasn't sure why, at first. Then she figured it out. She wasn't protecting him from it. She was deciding whether it was her problem to handle or his. She'd been deciding that since she arrived, what belonged to her here and what belonged to the transaction. The two things kept refusing to stay separate. She told him the next morning. He was in the barn when she found him, working on something with a fence post and a level and the focused unhurriedness he brought to everything physical. She told him his father had come, and what his father had said, and what she had done about it. She told it plainly, no extra color, and she watched us while she did. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he set down the level and said, "You asked him to leave. I suggested it. My father doesn't get suggested anywhere he doesn't want to go." "He went," Adelaide said. Fletcher looked at her. This time the thing that shifted in his face was harder to name. Not surprise exactly. More like someone seeing something they'd expected to see but hadn't quite believed in until now. "He'll come back," Fletcher said. "I know, he'll try to go around you. I know that too." She looked at him steadily. "I'm telling you so you're not caught off guard. Not to ask what to do about it." Something happened at the edge of his mouth. Not a smile. Something quieter than that. "All right," he said. He went back to the fence post. She walked back to the house, and it wasn't until she was back in the kitchen that she realized her hands had been shaking the whole time. Not from fear. From something else she didn't quite have a name for yet. There was a town meeting in Millhaven at the end of the month about a water rights dispute that was affecting 5 ranches in the valley. Adelaide found out about it from Percy, who mentioned it while they were fixing the chicken wire on the coop, and she mentioned it to Fletcher that evening, and he looked mildly surprised that she knew about it. "You going?" she asked. "Planning to. I'd like to come." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. They drove to Millhaven together, which was the first time they'd been in the truck together since the wedding day, and this time the silence felt different. Not counted miles, just 2 people with somewhere to be. The meeting was in the community hall, 40 or 50 people, 3 ranches she recognized from Percy's stories, and 2 she didn't. There was a man named Dalton Rue, who ran a property north of them, and who clearly thought Fletcher Callister owed him something, though Adelaide couldn't yet tell what. There was a woman named June Spear, who seemed to be keeping a mental ledger of everyone present, and there was a representative from the county water board named Arthur Gaines, who had the look of a man who had prepared for a different meeting entirely. Adelaide sat next to Fletcher and listened to everything. She took notes on the back of an envelope she found in her coat pocket. Halfway through, she leaned over to Fletcher and said quietly, "The Rue claim is based on a survey from 1987. If there's been any fence line adjustment since then, his numbers are wrong." Fletcher looked at the envelope, then at her. "There was a fence line adjustment in 2011, then his numbers are wrong." He looked back at the front of the room, and something settled in his posture that hadn't been settled before. When Dalton Rue stood up 20 minutes later and made his case loudly, and with a lot of gestures, Fletcher raised his hand and mentioned the 2011 adjustment calmly, and cited the document, and Arthur Gaines from the water board wrote something down. On the drive back, Fletcher said, "How'd you know about the survey?" June Spear mentioned it to the woman next to her before the meeting started. "I was standing nearby. You were listening." "I'm always listening," Adelaide said. He didn't say anything for a minute. Then, "Good." She looked out at the dark road and the dark valley and the familiar ridge against the sky, and something she'd been holding tight in her chest for a month loosened by a fraction. Just a fraction, but it was real. It was Percy, in the end, who told her what the ranch hands said about her. He wasn't trying to be kind. He just talked the way Percy always talked, without filtering much. They were stacking firewood behind the barn on a cold November morning, and he said casually, "Clem said you remind him of Mrs. Callister." Adelaide kept stacking. "The first Mrs. Callister, yeah. Not in how you look," he added, with the clarifying energy of someone who's put a foot wrong and knows it. "More in how you pay attention to things. She used to do that. Notice what needed doing before anyone said anything." Adelaide didn't respond for a while. The woods smelled like cedar and cold air. "That's a kind thing to say." "Clem's not a kind man," Percy said. "That's why it means something." She thought about that for a long time afterward. Not about Caroline. She'd learned not to prod at that particular absence too directly, like a bruise you know is there, but about the idea of being seen, of someone noticing that you were paying attention. It was a strange thing to be starved for without knowing it. The situation with Rowan Callister broke open on a Thursday in late November. Adelaide found out about it the way she found out about most things on that ranch. Not from Fletcher directly, but from watching Fletcher. He came in from the south pasture at midday, which he never did, and he went straight to the phone in the hallway, and the call lasted 20 minutes. When he came to the kitchen where she was making lunch, she looked at his face and said, "What happened?" He sat down at the table. He put both hands flat on the wood and looked at them for a moment. Then he told her. Rowan Callister had gone to the county land office and filed a challenge to the ranch's water rights, citing a technicality in a boundary description that had been on the books since the 1940s. The challenge had been filed without telling Fletcher, without telling Adelaide, and it had been filed through Quincy Deal's office, which meant it had been in motion before they'd ever come to the house. "He did this before we were married," Adelaide said. "Looks like it." She sat down across from him. She thought about Rowan Callister sitting across from her in the front room with his careful smile and his talk about legacy and responsibility. She thought about the way he'd looked at her when she stood at the open door. "He thought I'd be manageable," she said. Fletcher looked up at her. "Most people are." "I'm not most people." He held her gaze for a long moment. "No," he said quietly, "you're not." She pulled out the envelope from her coat pocket. She'd taken to keeping it with her, notes accumulating on the back, and she said, "The 1940s boundary description. That would have been filed before the highway easement in 1953. If the easement changed the reference points, the technicality doesn't hold." He stared at her. "How do you know about the highway easement?" "Percy told me about it when I asked why the East Road curves the way it does." A long pause. "Percy told you about a 1953 highway easement. Percy tells me everything," Adelaide said. "He doesn't realize he's doing it." Something broke open in Fletcher Callister's face then, not dramatically, not all at once, but like a seam giving way. He pressed his mouth together, his shoulders dropped an inch. He looked like a man who had been holding himself very still for a very long time, and had just in this moment allowed himself to stop. "All right," he said. His voice was different, quieter. "All right." They spent 3 hours at the kitchen table with the land records she pulled from the filing cabinet in his office. She'd reorganized the filing system in October, and she knew exactly where everything was, and the notes she'd been keeping, and a county map spread between them. By the end of it, they had a clear counter-argument. They called the Millhaven attorney that evening, a woman named Carol Birch, who Fletcher had been working with for years, and walked her through it. Carol Birch said, after a silence, "This is solid. Where'd this come from?" "My wife," Fletcher said. Adelaide was looking at the map. She heard him say it, and she didn't look up and she didn't say anything, but something happened in her chest, quiet and definite, like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. Rowan Callister dropped the challenge 2 weeks later. He didn't explain why. He didn't come to the ranch. Fletcher told Adelaide about it at breakfast. In the same matter-of-fact way he told her most things now, and she nodded and poured herself more coffee and said, "Good," and that was that. Except it wasn't that. Because that evening Fletcher came and found her in the garden. She'd started in the side yard. Small, nothing fancy. Just some late-season herbs and a rosemary bush she'd transplanted from a pot. And he stood at the edge of it with his hands in his pockets, and he said, "I want you to know something." She looked up at him. The light was low and gold, and the ridge behind the house was doing that purple thing again that she'd finally started letting herself appreciate. "I didn't know what my father was planning," he said. "With the marriage offer. I found out the same week you did. I want you to know that wasn't. I didn't want you to come here under false pretenses, whatever the situation is. I didn't want it to be that." She sat back on her heels and looked at him for a moment. There was a streak of dirt on her left hand, and the rosemary smelled sharp in the cold air. "I know," she said. "You know, I figured it out." She stood up. "You don't have that kind of calculation in you, it would show." He was quiet for a moment. "What does show?" he asked, and it wasn't challenging. It was the most genuinely curious she'd ever heard him sound. She thought about it honestly. About the biscuit he'd left on a plate for her the morning she'd had a bad headache and told him not to worry about breakfast. About the way he always positioned his truck between hers and the wind when they both parked by the barn. About how he'd never once in 4 months told her what to do about anything inside the house. "Consideration," she said. "You show consideration." He looked at her for a long time. The light went from gold to something softer. A horse somewhere near the barn made a low sound. "You show more than that," he said finally. And then he went back inside, and she stood in her garden for a while longer, and the rosemary kept smelling like rosemary, and the ridge kept going purple, and she thought about 4 months ago when she'd signed her name on a line and told herself it was just ink on a page. She'd been wrong about that. She'd known it for a while. She just hadn't let herself say it. She came inside. He was in the kitchen, making coffee he clearly didn't need at that hour, because he was a man who sometimes needed something to do with his hands. She understood that now. She understood a lot of things about him now that she hadn't expected to. She sat down at the table and said, "Fletcher." He turned around. He was holding the coffee pot and looking at her with that face that had learned, over 4 months, to give things away to her that it didn't give to anyone else. "I think," she said carefully, "that this stopped being only a transaction a while ago, for me." The coffee pot went down on the counter. He came and sat down across from her. Not next to her, but across, so he could look at her directly, which she'd noticed was how he handled things that mattered. "A while ago," he said. "Yes. How long?" She considered the water board meeting. Something in his expression went through several things she watched happen in sequence and couldn't quite name. "That was October," he said. "I know." He put his hand on the table, open, not reaching, just there. And she looked at it, and she thought about ink on pages and transactions and lifelines and the specific way you can come to know a person, by watching what they do when they think no one's paying attention. She put her hand in his. His fingers closed round hers, not tight, just present. "Adelaide," he said. And that was all he said. Her name, in his voice, which had taken 4 months to learn how to sound like that, like it was something he'd been keeping safe. Outside, the valley was dark and quiet and going about its business, the way valleys do regardless of what happens to people inside them. The horses were settled. The ridge was invisible now against the night sky. The ranch was exactly what it had always been, land and work and weather and time, except that it was also, she realized, the place where she had become someone she recognized. Someone who fixed screen doors and took notes on envelopes and stood at open doors and said, without flinching, he went. She didn't know what came next. She knew the winters out here were hard. She knew Rowan Callister wasn't finished, whatever Carol Birch had managed to shut down for now. She knew there were things in Fletcher's history she hadn't touched yet and things in her own she hadn't spoken of his, but she knew the weight of his hand. She knew the sound of his boots on the kitchen floor at 5 in the morning, and the way he passed the salt before she asked, and what it meant when he said good in that quiet voice. She had learned him the way you learn a place, slowly, through weather, through watching what holds. She held on.